Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome. Welcome to our session, our lightning panel entitled The Digital Fabric of Hybrid and Exiled Journalism in the MENA region. This panel will be in English. If you need translation, you can find headsets in the back corner. I'm Nick Benaquista. I'm the Senior Director at the Center for International Media Assistance, which is a think tank, a research unit based at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C. The National Endowment for Democracy, for those of you who are not familiar, is a funding organization that, among other things, provides a great deal of support, as much as 30% of its funding, for the media sector around the world. And CIMA's mission is to help the international community to understand the myriad and complex challenges that are facing media freedom and development around the world. I'm joined today by two excellent panelists. To my left, Aida Al-Kaisi, a co-founder of Jumar, an independent media platform in Iraq. She's a researcher, a consultant, a teacher at SOAS in London, and Aida has worked extensively across the region and beyond, including on an upcoming report for CIMA, looking at the exile media landscape globally. So we're really excited to have Aida with us today, and it's been great working with her. To her left is Khalid Mansour. Khalid has a long, prestigious career spanning 30 years. He's a prolific writer. He has worked with the UN, with a number of human rights organizations. He's currently on the board of Crisis Action and the Meta Oversight Board. With Khalid, you have a very strong advocate here for the rights of independent press in our contemporary digital environment. So he's a perfect panelist to speak to the issues that we have in this panel today. I just want to thank also ARIJ for allowing us all to be here. It is a real privilege to be a small part of this remarkable community that ARIJ has put together. This is my second ARIJ conference, and it's an amazing accomplishment. So thanks very much, and thanks also for giving us the challenge to prove that a 30-minute panel can be interesting. So we're on the clock, and I'll get us started. To frame this discussion, it's important to keep in mind that press freedoms, as you all know too well and very intimately, have been steadily on the decline for over a decade. Physical and legal threats confronting journalists have forced them to flee their home countries in record numbers. And we've seen this in a few figures. It's hard to quantify how many journalists, but we know that there's a wave of journalists being forced into exile in the past few years. CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, helped 63 journalists to find shelter in outside of their home country in 2020. In 2022, 2 years later, that number jumped to 206. Reporters Without Borders, RSF, saw a similar spike in demand for their assistance. In 2023, they helped 460 journalists to relocate outside of their home countries. That's more than double, 223 just the year before. The Special Rapporteur Irene Khan yesterday mentioned that in Sudan alone, 400 journalists have had to flee. And it's not just individuals, it's whole news outlets. Some of them forming for the first time in exile, such as Amu TV out of Afghanistan, but other very well and long established outlets also being forced into exile. La Prensa in Nicaragua, operating for 100 years, now having to operate in exile. So what this tells us is that we're witnessing really the rise of a new generation of exile media. But this session isn't just about growth in the number of journalists and media outlets operating in exile. It's also about how exile media is changing. And the digitalization of communication has enabled exile media to remain far more connected to the people back home And it's one of the reasons we're beginning to describe exile media, among other terms, as hybrid media. This new generation of hybrid media has new opportunities to provide quality reporting back home and to build and maintain mass audiences even while operating across borders. But this hybrid environment also creates new risks linked to digital safety and security and to the dependence of these hybrid outlets on large social media platforms, creating vulnerabilities to changes in those policies. And it's also, this conversation is important not just because exile media is growing and changing, but as it grows and changes, its role in our media environment is also changing. So media outlets, exile media outlets are able to position themselves along a broader spectrum than before. So you still have a number of exile media outlets focusing on that hard-hitting coverage of human rights abuses of the regime back home, while others are able to now focus on more mundane forms of daily coverage, even as they operate from exile. So the very role of exile media is changing, and with that, I would like to pose the first question to Ida, who is, as I said, a co-founder of one of these hybrid news organizations, Jumar, but also a researcher in this space. So she has she sees this from two different perspectives. I'd like to start by asking you, Ida, how this generation of exile media outlets, how you see them leveraging the digital news environment to innovate and change.
Thanks, Nick. So just to give a bit of background about Jumar. Jumar is an independent Iraqi media platform. We do operate a hybrid format. We're registered outside of Iraq, although we have a team of staff members and journalists based across Iraq, and then further staff members, editors, and other contributors based around the world. I also, as part of the research that I conducted on behalf of CIMA, I also spoke to multi-locational media organizations from Syria, Sudan, and even Tunisia. So organizations that were either completely in exile or operating, again, using hybrid formats and methods. And clearly for us at Jumar and for a lot of these organizations, without digital technologies, without Teams, for example, we wouldn't be able to exist in Jumar. We communicate with our staff, we make organizational decisions, editorial decisions, we share content. So those types of digital comms that have become prolific are integral, really, to us as an organization. To our governance and all of our kind of hierarchies and decision making. Another sort of innovation that came across in the interviews that I conducted, particularly coming out of Sudan, but also Syria, and also to a certain extent with our work in Jumar, was that actually news gathering operations have changed. So in contexts like Sudan, where there are large areas in Sudan where journalists are no longer able to operate and have actually left and moved. Sudanese media outlets, many of whom are operating now completely in exile, completely outside of Sudan, in neighboring countries around Sudan, are using WhatsApp groups, are using social media platforms to gather information from citizens and people on the ground, local CSOs, ordinary people in areas where a journalist cannot access. And this brings about a number of issues. It's creative, it's interesting, but also really emphasizes the importance of things like verification and fact-checking, because when you're receiving information and news from non-professional sources, there's a sort of issue with that. I mean, something else that also came up was this kind of more compromise, particularly with sort of photography, images, and video, was that when you're receiving that type of content from the ground, from non-professional sources, via WhatsApp, via social media platforms, professional quality is also an issue. But these are the kind of these are the things that you have to navigate as a media platform, if you like, or an organizational media organization that has to think on their feet in fluid situations using digital technologies. The other key thing that came across in the interviews, and is also something that's very important for us at Jamar, is that what digital technologies allow us to do, which is why we see the category of exile media sort of grow, or hybrid media, we've seen it grow over the last 10 or so years, is that we are now able to reach audiences in Iraq. So organizations that are based fully outside of a country are still able, using social media, unlike diaspora media that might have set up 15, 20 years ago, we're still able to get our content to audiences on the ground. So this is a completely new setup. It allows media in multi-locational setups to still be part of the local ecosystem, and that's something that we'll touch on a bit further later on in the session. What's also interesting in this regard, and what clearly came out of the interviews that I conducted, is that, again, when we're talking about sort of digital freedoms and digital rights, in contexts where there are restrictions on content, audiences now are digitally savvy enough to use VPNs to get around those restrictions. And that also sees the category change and sees more innovation and more creativity come out. And so finally, I just want to say, Nick, is that we are seeing shifts in journalism as a result. So journalism, social media has become part of the fabric of journalism for many organizations that are operating multi-locationally. And what that brings, which is something I think Khalid is hopefully going to touch on, are these issues with content moderation by the tech platforms, by governments. Algorithmic biases, all of these things are seeing us have to think about how we use social media in a different way, in a way that is innovative and kind of ensures that we're thinking on our feet.
Thanks, Ida. That's fascinating, and I think it's particularly interesting how you remarked on exile media increasingly being able to position themselves within the local media ecosystem. How have you done that at Jamar? How have you positioned Jamar relative to other Iraqi news outlets locally? And how have your decisions there, differed from what you see the decisions other exile media organizations are making?
So at Jamar, we don't work on breaking news. We don't work on daily news. We look at political issues, but from the bottom up, from a sort of everyday, the politics of the everyday, so to speak. So it's social issues, cultural issues, but also political issues from the view from the ground, or sort of grassroots. But that's our take. Different types of organizations are doing things differently. And this is really important, actually. This kind of hybrid format, as well as people who are still operating in country, independent media still operating in country, it's not a homogenous scene. People are doing things in different ways. It is constantly evolving. And that sort of category of what might have formerly been called exiled media, again, because of digital technologies, it no longer sits apart from the sort of wider ecosystem. So for us at Jamar, we hope, and I believe this is the case when I spoke to some of the Syrian media, for example, and the Sudanese media, that we're still all contributing to a form of pluralism in difficult contexts. And we're still talking to different audiences in different ways. And within that, we are creating, hopefully, a kind of independent media ecosystem, or challenging some of the dominant narratives in our countries, but in different ways and together. One of the big things that comes across in the research, and even from our work in Jamar, and there's a really interesting example of this with Sudan, is this idea of working together as a media ecosystem. So in the case of Sudan, where, as mentioned before, the majority of the media are now working outside of the country. They've created a collaboration, the Sudan Media Forum, that allows them to work together as a media ecosystem, as a media environment that does different things for different audiences in different ways, so that, and this is one of their objectives, so that when peace comes to Sudan, there's a possibility for an independent media to sort of take shape and take form. So there's a sort of advocacy element to that around the importance of independent media. So again, this idea of collaboration, I think, is really key to exile media or hybrid media.
Great, thanks, Ida. I mean, I think that idea of collaboration, especially relevant in the context of this event, and the Sudan Media Forum, I think, stands out as a really interesting example of how different outlets are working together. Thanks for that. Khalid, throughout this conference, there has been a reoccurring theme of all of the rapid changes in the digital environment that are affecting media, and it's everything from international frameworks, national policies and laws, cybercrime laws, digital repression online, and of course the rapid pace of technological change, including AI, and it's dizzying. It's hard to know where to focus. So the question I wanted to pose to you to begin with here is, if you could help us identify what you think is the priorities. There's so much out there. Where should we be focused on the digital environment for exile media and for all media that's now essentially dependent on this environment?
And you want me to do that in 4 minutes, right?
Yes, please.
Basically, thank you for the introduction, but let me correct you. It's 34 years I've been at it, and I thought of it like in 1990, when I used to leave the Reuters offices or Middle East News where I used to work, 1 in the morning, I would go to the corner immediately and buy 8 or 9 newspapers and magazines and read them before I go to sleep. When you speak about the digital environment, this is the only environment now. I only now buy maybe the New York Times or Al-Ahram in Egypt once every blue moon for nostalgic reasons. And our environment as a digital environment is controlled by 2 main forces, by governments and by the tech industry. The tech industry in 2 constellations. One are the service providers, which governments can shut down or up, depending on which government are we talking about, or control or use surveillance, and by the very large social media platforms for which I think every newspaper or news production house in this gathering relies on for 2 things. They rely on them for delivery, largely, and it's not, I mean, websites have become a repository of information rather than a delivery method, and for revenues. Now, the problem with delivery, I mean, delivery is you use Facebook or TikTok as an end in itself. People stop there, or use them for referrals to come to your websites. And people sometimes still go to websites, and there is a resurgence of newsletters, stuff like that. Still, you need the numbers, you need the traffic, because you need to tell either your donors that here's a proof of concept, so many people come to me, these are the eyeballs, or you use that traffic, hopefully, not necessarily for most of the news media in this region, you use the traffic to generate income, either from direct ads. I don't know of any news organization in this region that generates enough from direct ads, or from Facebook ads or Google ads, and that's largely individual content creators. Organizations, to the best of my knowledge, haven't been able to do that. Now, what are the challenges? What are the problems that we are facing here? The challenges, one, is, as you said, digital repression. Governments are either blocking websites or actually blocking services. Like 1 or 2 countries in this region block TikTok itself. Of course, people overcome that by using VPN. Secondly is the cyber crimes laws, which are ambiguous, unclear, and they are used and abused, and they are copied. Read the one from India, the one from Russia, the one from Egypt, they look like each other. It's like those guys talk a lot to each other. Of course, VPN is a partial solution, or the use of social media that cannot be banned. So instead of your website being blocked, you can use that. The big tech. One, you need to spend a lot of money on advertisement. Otherwise, you will be unrecommended, if people understand the term, of course, or downranked. And then you need to spend more and more dollars if you want ad income from these websites or directly. Your ads themselves for promotion are treated differently from your content. Ads can be rejected if they are seen to violate community standards of this forum or another. And different fora have different problems. X drowns, and I guess we're talking largely about serious media here, X drowns serious media. into a sea of sensationalism. Meta demotes and deranks political content, and most of you guys, of course, political content is like 70–80% of your content. And Meta has systematically, publicly and openly demoted and deranked or unrecommended, and these are very important because you're not going to get stuff. You put your picture, you and your cat, and you get 1,000 likes. You put an article about Palestine, and you get 2 shares. So all of us know that. And then TikTok and Instagram also need money because you need to repackage your stuff. You cannot put like your long text or even the long video. It has to be less than 1 minute, etc. So these are challenges that every maker has to work with in this environment.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Khalid. I mean, I think it highlights how exile media and escaping maybe the repression that they're facing in the home country, they find themselves confronting often a new array of challenges and restrictions imposed, as you say, by the policies of these platforms, none of which are hospitable, unfortunately, for independent news these days. So there's obviously an urgent mission to try to make these platforms, this environment, much more hospitable for news. And I think this venue here is a great place to have that conversation because we do have journalists, presumably some content creators, certainly some digital rights folks. Do you have some thoughts here for the room on how the digital rights community and the journalistic community can work more effectively together to make that environment more hospitable for news?
I think they do work together already. I mean, maybe they need to work more closely, and they need maybe to focus and prioritize. I mean, firstly, with the digital rights groups in general, we need to fight back. I mean, we need to fight back cybercrime laws, and not only because of their ambiguity, but because we know how they are being used and abused. And secondly, we need to fight also the international attempts at putting guidelines and certain legislations like the Cybercrime Convention to make sure that they are not again used and abused against us. So at national level, at international level. Secondly, we need to use the existing good or semi-good legislation in place. And I'm thinking of laws and legislations because that's digital rights. One of the things they do, they advocate on the legislative part and they fight persecution through legal means. But we need to use the existing good or semi-good ones like the Digital Services Act in Europe because it's extraterritorial and it enables us at least to tackle certain issues. And secondly, use the big tech companies, speak to them. I mean, they are in this room, and some of them all of them actually are members of things like the Global Network Initiative, or they committed themselves to the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or they established bodies like the body I work on, the Oversight Board, which is Meta oversight functions with binding decisions on the company to remove content or return content that has been removed or change their policies or the way they enforce them. Use these structures that have been created by this company. And finally, not only with digital rights, you should not work only regionally, work globally. There is a lot of work by news media on getting a fair share of ad revenue from the social media platforms. We know about efforts in Canada, Australia. Some of them are legislative. Some of them are banning certain social media platforms from posting their income without a fairer share of revenues. Join that. I know we are still weaker and our traffic is not that important still, but there is something to be gained there from joining networks fighting for that.
Great. Thanks a lot, Khalid. Thanks very much. I think there's a massive agenda here. We have a couple of questions that have come in online. The first relates to statistics. Arab journalists are targeted by authoritarian governments, especially in conflict zones. We've heard a great deal about tragic loss of life in Gaza. So we know this is a massive problem at the moment. Do we have more broadly the statistical data, someone asked online, regarding the crimes against journalists in the Arab world? That's one question. And I suppose I would extend that. We do have the data on loss of life. Where I think we're struggling is on digital repression of journalists. So I might direct you towards that aspect of the question. A second question is whether hybrid media networks can become an effective alternative for audiences who don't trust traditional media. So, I mean, I guess this goes to some of the points that Ida was making about, well, trust of hybrid media, having one foot outside of the country, on the one hand, can be a source of trust, but it can also be a source of distrust. And I guess what you've seen about how hybrid media navigate that trust challenge. So does someone want to take the question on digital repression? Do we have the data in the region?
I mean, there's a lot of data. I mean, just Google it. I mean, I know in Egypt there are 23 journalists that are still in prison because of their work. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, a lot of digital rights organizations in the region issue statistics. The issue is not how many. The issue is that it is a pattern, it is a trend, and we need to fight it back either through changing legislations or fighting in the legal courts. But it is a pattern, it's rampant and prevalent.
Thanks.
Can I add to
Yeah,
that?
please do.
I was just going to add that actually it is important to start thinking about sort of stats and sort of monitoring trends because, so for example, in countries where we have seen legislative restrictions, cybercrimes laws, other types of restrictions on media that have seen media have to leave the country or journalists have to operate outside of the country, in countries where we've seen rising online violence and disinformation against journalists, that's then where we see conflicts erupt. You know, so if we were to monitor some of those trends in a more systematic way, we could actually begin to start putting in place sort of early warning systems to start to sort of see where the next sort of, you know, conflict is going to erupt or where the next even sort of big exodus of journalists and media is going to come from and sort of, you know, build resilience in that regard.
Yeah. And I might just add to that, I think one other gap that I think we see in this region and elsewhere is a gap in the evidence for how platform policy changes affect media viability. So I think if we're going to hold these platforms to account, demonstrate to them the real impact that they're having on the information environment, we need to be armed with much greater evidence. And that's a gap too that I think we all need to work on. A topic that came up yesterday in a discussion amongst media outlets and digital rights activists, actually. Ida, did you want to tackle that second question on trust?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, actually, and it's something that we battle with all the time, and I know that other organizations do as well. So there's a kind of dual aspect to this. On the one hand, in a lot of cases, media that are operating in hybrid formats or media that are operating in difficult circumstances are operating in very partisan environments where audiences expect media to be politicized and expect media to report or cover topics in a particular way or be allied to particular parties or oligarchs or whatever it may be. So actually independent media and in many cases media who are operating or registered outside of a particular context are more trusted because they are seen to be operating outside of the kind of frameworks, regulation frameworks that manage and finance a lot of the media in the countries within which they live. However, there is also this issue with being associated with foreign agendas and being foreign agents. Particularly if you're based in a country in Europe or the US or whatever it may be. So that's also a big issue. And then there's also this issue of disinformation, of bots, of trolls. You know, so you do get comments on social media, you will get a pushback on content. You know, this is a German-funded organization, or this is an organization based in Chad, you know, say for example. So of course they're going to be saying these things, you know, and then there's this whole kind of like, again, there's a trend, particularly in this region, about this sort of positioning independent media as being immoral, you know, and that's also a kind of big issue. So, and that also affects trust.
Great, thanks.
Trust.
Ida, Khalid, thanks very much for your comments today. Thanks to all of you for being here. The IDA's report will be coming out in the coming months from the Center for International Media Assistance, looking at how Exile media is changing. And the report is also going to look at a topic we didn't cover today, which is how the international donor community can be a better partner. I think we have to recognize that not only is Exile media growing and changing, but it's here to stay. And so we need to really start thinking about how we can sustain hybrid media as a permanent part of the news ecosystem. It's a part of us. We need to work together to sustain it, its viability. So thanks very much to both of you, and thanks everybody. Thanks to ARIJ as well.